Ambassador Cathvorin stood at the observation deck of Orbital Station Vareth 9, his crystalline body catching the light of 3 distant suns as he watched the void of space with ancient, patient eyes. He had lived for 900 years and had seen many things. But today something new was coming. The war with the Vareth Dominion had raged for 60 years across 1,000 star systems, and the coalition of free worlds was losing. World after world had fallen to the Dominion's endless hunger. And now the coalition had grown desperate enough to accept help from anyone who would offer it. That was why the humans were coming. Cathvorin had read the reports about this species from the far edge of the galaxy. They came from a world called Earth, a death world of extreme temperatures and violent weather and predatory life forms. And somehow they had survived long enough to reach the stars. The reports said they were fragile creatures with soft skin and short lifespans, living barely 100 years before their bodies failed them. They had no natural armor like the Silicate Hegemony, no telepathy like the Void Singers, no venomous claws like the Kethmer. They had nothing but their primitive ships and their strange determination to join a war that was not their own. "They are here," announced the station commander, a massive creature of living stone named Grath. His voice rumbled like an earthquake as he pointed toward the viewport. Cathvorin turned his attention to the darkness beyond the glass, and he saw them emerge from faster-than-light travel one by one. Human ships, dozens of them, appearing in flashes of light like stars being born. He had expected to be impressed. But instead he felt something close to pity. The human vessels were ugly things, built from thick metal plates bolted together without elegance or grace. They lacked the flowing lines of silicate cruisers or the terrifying beauty of Vareth warships. They looked like they had been assembled by workers who cared nothing for art and everything for function. Redundant systems cluttered their hulls. Backup generators and emergency thrusters, and escape pods covering every surface like barnacles on an ocean rock. "Crude," Grath muttered beside him. And Cathvorin could only agree the other coalition members had gathered at the station to welcome their new allies. And whispers passed between them as the human fleet took formation. The Void Singers communicated their disappointment through telepathic waves that Cathvorin could feel brushing against his mind. The Kethmer clicked their mandibles in what he recognized as amusement. Even the normally silent crystalline watchers seemed to pulse with doubt. "They will serve as shields," one ambassador said, his voice carrying no malice but also no hope. "Every enemy shot that strikes a human ship is a shot that does not strike one of ours." Cathvorin said nothing. He simply watched as the human flagship moved toward the station's docking port, its name painted on the hull in the human's strange angular script. The ISS, unconquered, a foolish name, he thought. Every species was conquered eventually. The galaxy had taught that lesson countless times over millions of years. The docking procedures took an hour. And then the humans came aboard. Cathvorin made his way to the reception hall where the coalition leaders had gathered to greet their new allies. He positioned himself near the back of the crowd, content to observe rather than participate in the formal ceremonies. He was an ambassador of the Silicate Hegemony, yes, but he was also a scholar. And today he wished to study these strange, soft creatures. The airlock doors opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and the humans walked through. They were smaller than he had expected, standing barely half the height of most coalition species. Their bodies were covered in fabric uniforms rather than natural protection, and their skin was exposed at their faces and hands, soft and vulnerable and utterly without defense. They moved on 2 legs with a strange bouncing gait, as if they were always on the edge of falling forward. Leading them was a female of their species, her hair the color of dying embers and her eyes as green as toxic gases. She wore more decorations on her uniform than the others, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never learned to fear. This was Admiral Chun. the commander of humanity's contribution to the war effort. She stepped forward and raised one hand in greeting. And when she spoke, her voice was surprisingly strong for such a small creature. On behalf of the United Earth Coalition, I thank you for accepting our offer of alliance, she said, her words translated by the devices they all wore. We know we are newcomers to this galaxy, and we know that many of you doubt what we can offer. But I promise you this, humanity does not abandon its friends, and humanity does not surrender to tyrants. Polite sounds of acknowledgement rippled through the gathered ambassadors, but Kethvorin could feel the doubt that lay beneath them. These humans spoke brave words, but brave words meant nothing against Vorath plasma cannons. The formal greetings continued for another hour, full of empty promises and hollow ceremonies, and Kethvorin found his attention wandering. He had seen enough. These humans were just another desperate species, throwing themselves against the unstoppable tide of the Dominion, and they would be crushed just like all the others. He turned to leave the reception hall, ready to return to his quarters and compose a report for his government, explaining why the human alliance would change nothing. But then he felt something strange, a sensation, unfamiliar and unwelcome, crawled across his crystalline surface like static electricity before a lightning strike. He stopped moving and turned back toward the crowd. Searching for the source, Admiral Chun was looking at him. Somehow, across the crowded room full of towering alien bodies, her small green eyes had found his. She held his gaze with an intensity that made his ancient heart flicker with an emotion he had not felt in centuries. And then she smiled. It was a simple expression, just the corners of her mouth turning upward and her lips parting slightly. But something about it made Kethvorin's entire being go cold, because when her lips parted, he saw her teeth, and he realized that this soft, fragile creature was bearing the weapons of a predator. Her smile was not a gesture of friendship. It was a warning. Kethvorin left the reception hall faster than dignity allowed, and he spent the rest of the night in his quarters, unable to shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something important, something that would change everything he thought he knew. The humans had arrived, and for the first time in 900 years, Ambassador Kethvorin of the Silicate Hegemony felt afraid of something he did not understand. The war was about to change, and he was not sure the galaxy was ready for what was coming. 3 weeks after the humans arrived, the Coalition War Council gathered in the Great Chamber at the heart of Vareth 9 to discuss the crisis at Iliath. Ambassador Kethvorin took his place among the observers, his crystalline form still and watchful as the leaders of a dozen species argued about the fate of a world. Iliath was sacred to the Void Singers, a planet where their ancestors had first developed telepathy millions of years ago. Its temples held relics of immense spiritual importance, and its loss would break the heart of an entire civilization. But the Vorath Dominion had surrounded it with a fleet of 300 warships, and they had cut every supply line. And they had made it very clear that anyone who tried to break the siege would be destroyed. Supreme Commander Velthus, a Void Singer whose mental presence filled the room like a cold wind, projected the tactical display for all to see. It showed Iliath as a small blue sphere surrounded by red markers representing Dominion vessels, and the sight of it made several ambassadors look away in sorrow. The mathematics are clear, Velthus announced, his thoughts translating into words through the chamber systems. We do not have the ships to break the siege without losing 60% of our remaining fleet. Such losses would leave us unable to defend our core worlds. Therefore, logic demands that we abandon Iliath and consolidate our forces for the defense of more strategically vital systems. Murmurs of reluctant agreement filled the chamber. No one wanted to abandon the sacred world, but no one could argue with the numbers. War was mathematics, after all, and the mathematics said that Iliath was lost. Kethvorin watched the Void Singer delegation receive this news. Their forms flickered with grief, their telepathic emanations washing over the room in waves of sorrow. But they did not protest. They were logical beings, and they understood that emotion could not overcome reality. The vote was about to be called when Admiral Chun stood up. She had been sitting with the human delegation near the back of the chamber, small and quiet and easy to overlook among the giants of the coalition. But now she rose to her feet and walked toward the central platform. And something about the way she moved made everyone stop talking. "I request permission to speak," she said, her voice calm but carrying an edge that Kethvarin had learned to recognize over the past 3 weeks. Supreme Commander Velthas regarded her with what might have been pity. "Admiral Chun, you are new to this council and perhaps do not understand our procedures. The decision has already been reached." "We cannot." "With respect, Commander," Chun interrupted, and the room went silent because no one interrupted a void singer. "No decision has been reached. A vote has not been called, and I have a right to present an alternative strategy before that vote takes place." Velthas paused, his telepathic presence flickering with surprise, and then he gestured for her to continue. "Very well, Admiral. Present your alternative." "Though I cannot imagine what it might be." Chun activated her own display device, and suddenly the tactical hologram changed. The red markers representing the Varth fleet were still there, but now blue arrows appeared, showing a path directly through the center of the enemy formation. "We attack," Chun said simply. For a long moment, no one spoke. Kethvarin thought his translator must have malfunctioned, because surely this small soft creature had not just suggested what he thought she had suggested. Then the chamber erupted. "Impossible," shouted the Kethmar commander, his mandibles clicking in agitation. "Their fleet outnumbers our available forces 3-1. The kill zone they have established would destroy any approaching vessels before they reached weapons range." Added a crystalline watcher, its light pulsing with alarm. "This is not strategy," Velthas declared, his mental voice cold with disapproval. "This is suicide. I will not order coalition forces to their deaths on a fool's errand." Chun waited for the noise to die down before she spoke again, and when she did, her voice had not changed at all. She was still calm, still steady, still utterly unshaken by the outrage surrounding her. "I am not asking you to order coalition forces anywhere," she said. "I am telling you that humanity will break the siege ourselves. You can support us, or you can watch from a safe distance. But either way, we are going." The silence that followed was heavier than before. Kethvarin found himself leaning forward, his ancient curiosity stirred despite his better judgment. He had studied war for centuries, and he had never heard a commander speak this way. "Admiral Chun," Velthas said slowly, his telepathic tone now carrying something that might have been concern. "Perhaps you do not understand the situation. If you attack that fleet with your current forces, you will lose 70 to 80% of your ships. That is not a battle. That is annihilation." Chun nodded as if he had just told her the weather forecast. "Yes, I know. And you would still attack?" "Yes. Why?" Chun turned to face the entire chamber, her green eyes moving from species to species, and when she spoke, her words carried a weight that Kethvarin had never felt from such a small creature. "Because you are thinking about this war the wrong way," she said. "You fight to minimize losses. You calculate acceptable casualties and retreat when the numbers turn against you. You believe that preserving your forces is the same as winning." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Humanity does not fight that way. We do not fight to minimize losses. We fight to win. And sometimes winning means accepting losses that seem insane by your standards. We call it sacrifice, and it is the reason we are still alive after surviving a world that tried to kill us every single day for millions of years." She pointed at the holographic display, at the blue arrows cutting through the heart of the Varth fleet. "If we attack, Yes, we will lose ships. We will lose many ships. We will lose friends and loved ones and heroes who deserve to live. But we will also punch through their lines and reach Iliath and break the siege. And while we are doing that, the Vorath will learn something they have never learned before. They will learn that there is a species in this galaxy that cannot be scared into submission. Admiral Chun lowered her hand and looked directly at Supreme Commander Velthus. Fear is the Dominion's greatest weapon. They win because their enemies know that fighting back means death, so they surrender instead. But what happens when they meet an enemy that chooses death and keeps fighting anyway? What happens when they kill us and kill us and kill us, and we just keep coming? She smiled that predator's smile that had haunted Kethvorin's thoughts for weeks. They break. They always break. Because no species in the history of our world has ever been able to handle an enemy that refuses to quit. The chamber remained silent as Chun walked back to her seat. And Kethvorin realized that he was witnessing something historic. This small, soft creature from a death world at the edge of the galaxy had just challenged everything the Coalition believed about warfare. The vote was called an hour later, and the result surprised no one. The Coalition chose to retreat and consolidate, but humanity chose differently. 3 days later, Admiral Chun led her fleet toward Iliath, and Kethvorin requested permission to observe from a shielded vessel. He did not know why he wanted to watch. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps dread, perhaps both all. He knew was that he needed to see what would happen when these mad creatures finally met the unstoppable might of the Vorath Dominion. He did not know that what he was about to witness would change him forever. The observation vessel Silent Witness hung at the edge of the Iliath system, its shields set to maximum and its engines ready to flee at the first sign of danger. Aboard it, Ambassador Kethvorin pressed his crystalline face against the viewport and watched the human fleet advance toward certain destruction 47 ships. That was all humanity had sent to break a siege held by 300 Vorath warships. 47 crude metal vessels crewed by soft, fragile creatures who live barely a century, sailing straight into the greatest concentration of enemy firepower in the entire war. It was madness. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. They have entered the kill zone, announced the Silent Witness's captain, his voice carrying the grim certainty of someone watching an execution. The Vorath are opening fire. Kethvorin watched as the void of space came alive with death. Plasma bolts streaked across the darkness like rivers of liquid fire. Thousands of them pouring from the Dominion fleet in a continuous storm of destruction. The first human ship, a destroyer named Defiant, took 17 direct hits in the first 3 seconds. Its shields collapsed, its hull ruptured, and its engine core detonated in a bloom of white light that briefly outshone the distant stars. The humans did not stop. The fleet did not scatter or retreat or even slow down. Instead, they accelerated, pushing their crude engines beyond safe limits as they drove deeper into the wall of fire. Kethvorin watched in disbelief as ship after ship was struck, damaged, destroyed. And still the survivors kept coming. "This is insanity," the captain whispered, his voice barely audible over the sounds of distant explosions. "They are throwing their lives away," but Kethvorin said nothing. He could not speak. He could only watch as the humans demonstrated something he had never seen in 9 centuries of life. They were dying. And they did not care a cruiser named Thermopylae lost its forward section to a concentrated plasma barrage, but instead of breaking apart, its remaining crew used emergency thrusters to spin the crippled vessel around and ram it directly into a Vorath carrier. The collision tore both ships apart in a cascade of fire and debris. And Kethvorin realized that the humans had died on purpose. A frigate named Last Stand took a hit that killed its bridge crew. And for a moment, it drifted without direction. Then its emergency lights flickered on, And the ship surged forward again as someone in the engine room took command and aimed a dying vessel at the nearest enemy. It managed to destroy 2 Vorath destroyers before it finally broke apart. A transport ship named Hope's Light somehow made it through the outer defensive line despite having no weapons at all. Kethvorn later learned that its captain had flown directly into the plasma streams, using her ship's bulk to absorb shots that would have killed the warships behind her. She died so that others could live, and she did it without hesitation. "I do not understand," the captain said, his voice shaking. "Why do they not retreat? Surely they see that they cannot win." Kethvorn finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "They are not trying to survive. They are trying to win. They are not the same thing." The battle raged on, and the human losses mounted into numbers that would have broken any other species. 10 ships gone, then 15, then 20. Half their fleet reduced to burning wreckage in less than an hour of fighting, and still they kept coming. Kethvorn's sensors picked up a human transmission, broadcast on all frequencies so that everyone in the system could hear it. He activated his translator and listened. It was a woman's voice, laughing. "This is Captain Rodriguez of the ISS Fury," she said, her words punctuated by explosions and the screaming of alarms. "We have lost main power. Life support is failing, and we are on fire in 6 different compartments. I just want the Vorath to know that my gunners are still at their stations, and we are not done yet. You want to kill us, you lizard-faced bastards. Then come over here and do it properly." The Fury lasted another 4 minutes, during which it destroyed 3 enemy vessels and damaged 7 more. Captain Rodriguez was still laughing when her ship finally broke apart. Something changed in the battle after that. Kethvorn could not identify it at first, but he felt it somehow. A shift in the rhythm of the fighting that made his crystalline heart pulse with confusion. Then he realized what it was. The Vorath were slowing down. Their plasma fire was becoming less accurate. Their formations less cohesive. Ships that should have been pressing the attack were instead holding back, keeping their distance from the burning human vessels. It was as if they had suddenly forgotten how to fight. No, Kethvorn realized. Not forgotten. They were afraid the Vorath Dominion had conquered 100 worlds through terror. They were the monsters that haunted the nightmares of 1,000 species. They had never faced an enemy that did not fear them, and now they did not know what to do, because how do you terrorize someone who's already dead? How do you break an enemy who charges toward your guns with joy in their hearts? How do you defeat a species that treats death not as an end, but as a weapon? The human fleet, what remained of it, punched through the Vorath defensive line, just as the Dominion's nerve finally shattered. Kethvorn watched in amazement as enemy ships began to scatter, breaking formation and fleeing in all directions. The siege that had seemed unbreakable 2 hours ago was suddenly collapsing like a house built on sand. Admiral Chun's flagship, the ISS Unconquered, emerged from the chaos with its hull blackened and its shields gone and half its weapons destroyed. But it was still flying, still fighting, still leading what was left of the fleet toward the sacred world of Iliath, and on its bridge, Admiral Chun was giving orders in the same calm voice she had used at the War Council, as if this moment of impossible victory was exactly what she had expected all along. The siege was broken. The sacred world was saved, and the price was 23 human ships and over 4,000 human lives. Kethvorn remained at the viewport long after the battle ended, his ancient mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. He had seen courage before, and he had seen sacrifice, and he had seen determination, but he had never seen anything like this. He had never seen a species that looked death in the eyes and smiled. He had never seen creatures so fragile and so short-lived fight as if they had nothing to lose and everything to gain. He had never understood why some of the older races whispered about humans with fear in their voices. Why they called them the Mad Ones, the Death Wishers, the species that should not exist. Now he understood. Now he knew why the stars feared them. And for the first time in 900 years, Cathvoran began to wonder if the coalition might actually win this war. The surface of Iliath was burning when Cathvoran's transport touched down 3 days after the space battle ended. The Varth had fortified the planet during their siege, building bunkers and weapon emplacements and a massive command fortress on the plains near the sacred temples. Now the humans were fighting to take it all back, and the cost was written in blood and fire across the ancient landscape. Edavaran had requested permission to accompany the ground forces as a coalition observer, and Admiral Chun had granted it with that predator's smile of hers. "You watched us die in space," she had said. "You might as well watch us die on the ground, too. Maybe then you will finally understand what we are." He did not understand yet, but he was beginning to. The human landing had been brutal, beyond anything Cathvoran had witnessed in centuries of warfare. The Varth defenders had fought with desperate fury, knowing that their fleet had abandoned them, knowing that no reinforcements were coming. They had made the humans pay for every meter of ground in casualties that would have caused any other species to retreat. Humans did not retreat. They died by the dozens, by the hundreds, their soft bodies torn apart by plasma fire and explosive shells and the slashing claws of Varth warriors. And every time one fell, another stepped forward to take their place, moving through the carnage with a grim determination that made Cathvoran's crystalline heart ache with something he could not name. He walked among them now, his ambassadorial status granting him access to the front lines where the fighting had paused for a brief moment of rest. Human soldiers sat in the ruins of a bombed-out building, their faces covered in dirt and blood and exhaustion, their eyes carrying the weight of too much death seen too quickly. Oblia, young soldier, noticed him watching and raised a hand in greeting. "Ambassador," she said, her voice hoarse from shouting orders over the sounds of battle. "Come to see the monkeys dance?" Cathvoran did not understand the reference, but he recognized the bitter humor in her tone. "I have come to understand," he said carefully, "though I am not sure I ever will." The soldier laughed, a short, harsh sound that held no joy. "Yeah, well, join the club. Half the time, we do not understand ourselves, either." She gestured for him to sit beside her, and he did, folding his crystalline limbs carefully to avoid the sharp debris scattered across the ground. From this position, he could see the Varth command fortress in the distance, a massive structure of dark metal that rose from the plains like a monument to conquest. "We are hitting that tomorrow," the soldier said, following his gaze. "Final push. Command says if we take the fortress, the rest of the planet will fold. How many of you will die?" Cathvoran asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. The soldier shrugged. "Enough. Too many." "Does it matter?" "It matters to me," he replied, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice. "I have watched your people throw away their lives with what appears to be joy, and I cannot comprehend it. Do you not value your existence? Do you not fear the end?" The soldier was quiet for a long moment, staring at the distant fortress with eyes that had seen too much. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before. "Of course we fear it," she said. "Every single one of us is terrified. We lie awake at night, thinking about the people we have lost and wondering if tomorrow will be our turn. We are not fearless, Ambassador. We are just stubborn." She turned to look at him, and he saw something in her eyes that he had not expected. Not rage, not bloodlust, but a deep and terrible sadness. "We fight because we have to," she continued, "because there are things more important than our own survival. Our friends, our families, the people counting on us. When I charged that bunker this morning, I was not thinking about glory or victory. I was thinking about the soldier next to me, the one who saved my life yesterday, and how I would rather die than let him down. Kethvorin processed her words in silence, feeling something shift inside his ancient understanding of the universe. You fight for each other, he said slowly. We fight for each other, she agreed. That is the secret, Ambassador. That is why we keep going when logic says we should quit. Because the person next to us is counting on us. And we will burn the whole galaxy down before we let them fall alone. An explosion in the distance interrupted their conversation, and the soldier leaped to her feet, grabbing her weapon with practiced speed. Kethvorin followed her toward the source of the sound and found a scene that confused him even more than the battles he had witnessed. A Vorath warrior lay on the ground, wounded and disarmed, its scales torn and its blood pooling beneath it. Standing over it was a human medic, not with a weapon raised to finish the kill, but with bandages and medical supplies, working frantically to stop the creature's bleeding. What are you doing? Kethvorin asked, unable to keep the shock from his voice. That is the enemy. It was trying to kill you moments ago. The medic looked up at him with tired eyes. Yeah, and now it is wounded and helpless. I am a healer, Ambassador. I do not get to choose who I save based on what uniform they wear, but it is Vorath. Its species has slaughtered millions of your people, and that makes it okay for me to let it suffer? The medic shook her head, her hands never stopping their work. We are not animals. We choose what we are. If I let this one die when I could have saved it, then what am I fighting for? Kethvorin watched her save the life of the enemy, and something broke inside him. Not in a painful way, but in the way that dawn breaks the darkness. Suddenly, finally, he began to understand. These humans were not mindless killing machines. They were not death-seeking lunatics who cared nothing for life. They were something far more complicated and far more terrifying. They were creatures who felt everything, the fear and the grief and the rage and the compassion. They felt it all with an intensity that would destroy most species. And instead of letting those feelings control them, they chose how to act despite them. They could kill with terrible efficiency and then weep for the fallen. They could charge into certain death and then stop to save an enemy's life. They could be monsters and saints in the same moment. And that was what made them unstoppable. The assault on the fortress began the next morning, and Kethvorin watched from a safe distance as the humans threw themselves against the Vorath defenses. He saw soldiers fall and others take their place. He saw wounded fighters drag themselves forward on broken limbs because they refused to quit. He saw a commander carry the body of a fallen friend while still giving orders to his troops. The fortress fell by sunset, and the Vorath commander surrendered with something like relief in his alien eyes. He had fought humans for 3 days, and it had broken something inside him. Not his body, but his belief that the galaxy made sense. Kethvorin understood that feeling perfectly. He had come to Iliath to observe, but he left it changed. The humans had shown him something that could not be unseen. A truth about courage and sacrifice and the terrible beauty of creatures who chose love over survival. War was not over yet. But Kethvorin already knew how it would end. The Vorath could not break a species that had already broken itself and reformed into something stronger. No one could. 1 year after the Battle of Iliath, the Vorath Dominion signed the Treaty of Unconditional Surrender aboard the very station where Ambassador Kethvorin had first watched the human fleet arrive. He stood in the same observation deck, his crystalline form older now and marked by the experiences of a war that had changed everything. And he watched the Vorath High Commander press its claw to the document that ended 10,000 years of conquest. The ceremony was formal and cold, full of diplomatic language and careful protocols. But Kethvorin saw the truth beneath the surface. The Vorath were not surrendering because they had been outfought or outmaneuvered or outproduced. They still had ships, still had soldiers, still had the capacity to wage war for another century if they chose. They were surrendering because they were afraid. He had spoken with captured Varth officers during the final campaigns, and he had heard the same story repeated in 100 different ways. They did not understand humans. They could not predict them. They could not break them. Every strategy that had worked against other species failed. Against these small, soft creatures from the edge of the galaxy, terror was useless against an enemy that smiled in the face of death. Siege warfare was pointless when the besieged were willing to starve. Rather than yield overwhelming force meant nothing to soldiers who treated their own destruction as an acceptable price for victory. The Varth had conquered through fear for 10,000 years, and now they had finally met a species that could not be frightened. The experience had shattered something deep in their collective psyche, and they wanted it to stop more than they wanted to win. Kethvorin understood that feeling. He had felt it himself during those terrible days on Iliath. The surrender ceremony ended, and the delegates dispersed to their ships. And the great war that had threatened to consume the galaxy was officially over. But Kethvorin knew that the work was only beginning. He had been asked by the Silicon Hegemony to prepare a report on humanity, a comprehensive analysis of this new species that had burst onto the galactic stage with such devastating effect. His government wanted to understand what they were dealing with, how to interact with humans, how to avoid ever becoming their enemy. Kethvorin had spent the past year gathering data, conducting interviews, observing human behavior in war and peace, and everything in between. Now, finally, he was ready to deliver his conclusions. The Council of Elders convened in the crystalline halls of the Hegemony homeworld, their ancient forms glittering like stars in the dim light. Kethvorin stood before them, feeling the weight of their attention pressing against his mind. And he began to speak. "Honored elders," he said, his voice resonating through the chamber. "I have studied humanity for 1 year, and I have reached conclusions that will challenge everything we believe about the nature of sentient life." He paused, gathering his thoughts, remembering all the moments that had brought him to this understanding. Humans are not the strongest species in the galaxy. They are fragile, easily broken, vulnerable to damage that would barely inconvenience a silicate. Their lifespans are laughably short. Their technology is crude. Their position in the galactic hierarchy is insignificant by any objective measure. The elders flickered with confusion. This was not what they had expected to hear about the species that had just ended a war. And yet, Kethvorin continued, "They are the most dangerous beings I have ever encountered. Not despite their weaknesses, but because of them." He projected images from his memory, scenes from the war that still haunted his thoughts. Ships ramming enemy vessels, soldiers charging through fire, medics saving the lives of enemies, commanders weeping over fallen friends. Humans form bonds with each other that defy rational analysis. They call it love, though that word does not translate properly into our language. They attach themselves to other beings with such intensity that they will sacrifice everything, including their own existence, to protect them. I have seen humans die for strangers they met hours before, simply because those strangers were part of their unit, their crew, their people. The elders listened in silence, their crystalline forms perfectly still. They call this pack bonding, and it is their greatest strength. A human alone is weak, but humans together are terrifying. They fight not for personal survival, but for each other. And this makes them willing to accept costs that would break any other species. Kethvorin thought of Admiral Chun, still commanding her battered fleet, still leading her people into battle after battle, despite losing half of everyone she had ever served with. But there is something else. He continued, his voice growing heavier. Something that I did not understand until the very end of my observations. He projected one final image. A human soldier, wounded and exhausted, sitting in the ruins of a conquered city. crying. They feel everything, Kethvorin said quietly. Every death, every loss, every moment of pain and fear and grief. They do not suppress their emotions as we do. They do not transcend them as the Void Singers claim to. They feel them fully, completely, with an intensity that would destroy most minds. The image changed to show the same soldier standing up, wiping away tears, and walking back toward the front lines. And then they keep going anyway, Kethvorin. Let the silence stretch for a long moment before delivering his final assessment, honored elders. Here is my recommendation. Do not make enemies of humanity. Not because they will defeat us in battle, though they might. Not because they are cruel or vengeful, though they can be. Make friends with them because they are incapable of giving up. He thought of Captain Rodriguez, laughing as her ship burned around her. Of the medic saving a Vorath warrior. Of the young soldier who fought not for victory, but for the person beside her. If we ever go to war with humanity, they will die. They will die by the millions, by the billions if necessary. They will die until the stars themselves grow cold. But they will not stop. They will not surrender. They will not break. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. They will simply make us watch them die, smiling and defiant and unbroken, until we cannot bear to kill another. Until the weight of their sacrifice crushes our will to fight. Until we surrender not because we have lost, but because we cannot stand to win against such an enemy. The elders conferred among themselves in the silent telepathic way of their kind. And when they finally spoke, their voices carried a weight of decision. Your report will be classified at the highest level. The eldest elder pronounced. Its contents will be shared only with those who need to know. And our official policy toward humanity will be revised immediately. Kethvorin nodded, unsurprised. He had expected nothing less. What policy do you recommend? The elder asked. Kethvorin thought for a long moment, remembering every moment of the past year, every lesson he had learned from watching these impossible creatures. And when he finally answered, his words carried the weight of absolute certainty. Be kind to them, he said. Welcome them. Trade with them. Befriend them. Learn from them if you can, because they have much to teach us about courage and love and the power of choosing what you are. He paused, his crystalline eyes reflecting the light of distant stars. But whatever you do, never give them a reason to charge. Because if they ever decide that we are their enemy, if they ever point that terrible loyalty and that bottomless courage in our direction, we will not survive it. Not because they will kill us all, but because we will lose the will to keep fighting long before they do. The council accepted his recommendation, and new orders went out across the hegemony. Humanity was to be treated as the most valued of allies, and in quiet halls and shadow councils across the galaxy, other species reached the same conclusion. The Vorath had been the mightiest empire in known space, and humanity had broken them not through superior strength, but through sheer refusal to quit. The stars had learned to fear the small, soft creatures from Earth, and Kethvorin, ancient ambassador of the Silicate hegemony, had learned something even more important. He had learned that true strength was not about armor or weapons or lifespans. It was about choosing to stand up when everything told you to stay down. It was about fighting for the ones you loved. Even when you knew you could not win, it was about being human, and though he would never be human himself, Kethvorin decided that he would try to remember their lessons for whatever centuries remained to him. Because if creatures so small and so fragile could face the darkness with such courage, then surely the rest of the galaxy could learn to do the same. The war was over, but humanity's story was just beginning.